And everybody recognizes that the horse is fundamentally a non-ruminant herbivore. And that means, but it's actually really important because it means both physiologically and importantly psychologically, they have evolved to be suited to spend the majority of their time eating high fiber based diets. They also rely to a large extent for their nutrient supply on the continual microbial fermentation that in fact starts in the stomach, but is undertaken mainly in the cecum and colon and hindgut. But on top of that, we have to remember that the horse evolved to be a social herd animal, and that is part of their feeding behavior.
Hello, and welcome to the Pet Food Science Podcast, where we dive into the science, trends, and innovations that shape the way we approach companion animal nutrition. I'm your host, Dr. Alex Rankovic, and today's episode is extra special since for the first time on this podcast, we're venturing beyond dogs and cats to explore the wonderful world of horses. While our usual focus on this podcast has been dogs and cats, we're broadening our scope to explore the unique challenges and considerations when it comes to feeding horses. I'm very honored to bring you this episode, not only because it is the first equine-focused episode, but also because we have the incredible Dr. Pat Harris here with us today. For those familiar with equine nutrition and the research in this field, Dr. Harris needs no introduction, but for our listeners who may be less familiar, Dr. Harris is the Director of Science for Mars Horse Care and head of the Waltham Equine Studies Group. She's also a boarded veterinary nutritionist with the European College of Veterinary and Comparative Nutrition and has been an author or co-author on over 500 scientific papers, abstracts, and book chapters. Welcome, Dr. Harris, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, and it's a real pleasure to be here and to hopefully share the knowledge and the excitement and the privilege of working with horses.
I agree. They are they're interesting in both a good and a bad way, I think, when we compare them to dogs and cats and how we feed them. So I'm really excited that I get to talk to you and some of the work that's been done in this field and hopefully just develop that evolution of understanding of where we are and where we've been and where we're going when it comes to equine nutrition. So to start, Dr. Harris, could you tell us a bit more about yourself? I know I gave a brief introduction, but we'd love to hear more about your background, your career path, and what led you into equine nutrition.
Great. I mean, I always say that I'm a veterinarian by training, but a nutritionist by choice. And I think it really came during my PhD when I did a PhD at the Animal Health Trust in Newmarket into tying up. And it really became apparent to me that nutrition has the ability to positively or negatively affect the welfare, but also the behavior, performance, and for me, the health of horses. And so I went on to really dedicate my career to try to understand how we can harness this power of nutrition for the benefit of horses. What's kept me going, to be honest, the collaborators and students that I've been working with who constantly invigorating the questions, the way they work, how we find. And I think there's also, for all of us or any of you are listening, there's that excitement of all the hard work that leads to your expected and then quite often unexpected insights. And I suppose, again, I'm talking to the converted, but it's really knowing that nutrition can make a difference. And I've wanted to ensure that vets, but also the owners and carers, really know this, but also have the information available that can make the best choice for their horses.
A longer, healthier lifespan for our pets. That is EW Nutrition's target. With immunoglobulins, that target is within reach. IGY are a young generation technology platform, an innovative solution that has been tried and tested over the last decades and can now yield tangible benefits. Immunoglobulins from egg yolk improve the animal's response to pathogens in the gut or in the mouth. They're easy to administer, they're perfectly safe, and they just work. Made with passion, proven with science.
I agree with you, and I really like that you brought up having results that you weren't expecting when it comes to research and what that means. And I think for a lot of the students that are maybe listening to this podcast too, often they have a hypothesis, and if their results don't match, they think they've done something wrong when, in reality, it's good when things aren't the way we expect, because it just opens the door for so much more and so much more learning and opportunity. So that's really fascinating. Thank you so much. So, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I think I read that research.com recently ranked you one of the best scientists globally in the field of animal science. Is that true?
Wasn't expecting that, but yes, yes, there are many ways of ranking people and many ways of doing it. But in their ranking, yes, and certainly in the equine only field for someone who only publishes, yes, nicely highly ranked, which I think is good. Good for the equine that we are prominent and we're publishing and getting hopefully the message. But yes, that was unexpected.
Did you celebrate?
No, not really.
Just went and published some more.
But I suppose taking that point to anybody there, publishing is one way. I think it's more thinking of ways that we can get an impact. So I think it's trying to make sure that we present, we do podcasts, we do infographics, we do articles, because we want to make sure it gets to everyone and gets to the nutritionists, but the vets and carers, and most importantly, owners and carers, really. So I think publication is one way. It shows the credibility of your work because it's been peer reviewed. But I think it's that cascading that's important.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I think, doing research is one thing, and it's obviously wonderful and it's great and we should continue to do so. But if it doesn't get into the hands of the people that are really going to use that and benefit from that, then I don't think we've done our due diligence and we've done what we were intending to do. But it's such an honor for me to have you here and to get this opportunity to talk to you, because you are one of the leading experts in equine nutrition. And I know I could ask you so many questions, but for our focus today, I'd really like to give our audience a strong foundation and start with some of those sort of fundamentals, I think, when it comes to feeding horses and considering how and, what we feed them ultimately. So for horses, I think, especially when we compare them to our other companion animal species like the dog and the cat, they really do have this unique gastrointestinal physiology. And again, whether that makes things more complicated or harder to manage is a whole other conversation. But would you be able to speak to some of the key features of the equine digestive tract and how they shape a horse's dietary needs and our feeding practices?
Do you know what? That is a really good question, because it's probably the key starting point. And everybody recognizes that the horse is fundamentally a non-ruminant herbivore. And that means, but it's actually really important because it means both physiologically and importantly psychologically, they have evolved to be suited to spend the majority of their time eating high fiber based diets. They also rely to a large extent for their nutrient supply on the continual microbial fermentation that in fact starts in the stomach but is undertaken mainly in the cecum and colon and hindgut. But on top of that, we have to remember that the horse evolved to be a social herd animal. And that is part of their feeding behavior. And they also evolved to be a selective herbivore, and they choose naturally from a seasonally and geographically varying diet, and they would naturally both graze and browse over very large distances. So we need to take all of those into consideration. And then, as you said, we have to look at their gut. And their intestinal system, key is the fact that it's really, you should think of it almost in two sections. So the first has similarities to the pre-cecal or pre-hindgut digestive system of a monogastric animal. And that's like a dog or even man. But the second section is more like the rumen of the cow, because that's where the majority of the fermentation. So this means you can't use all the information we get from dog or humans, because of course it's totally different. And you can't work from the cow, because unlike the ruminant, the microbial fermentation occurs after the monogastric-like section rather than before. So when we're thinking of feeding the horses, we have to think of those two sections. But the problem is the horse isn't either one or the other, or even a combination, because it's unique. And for me, some of the key aspects that I simply try and get over is that the horse only produces saliva when it chews. And it is a trickle feeder, so it naturally would spend up to 15 or more hours a day naturally foraging. But it forages, and if you watch a horse in the wild, they chew and then they move, and then they chew and they move. And they'll do that for a period of time, and then they'll have a break, and then they do it again. And it's hot wired to do that chewing. And it affects the whole of its digestive tract. So if you go down it, you then have a small inelastic stomach. And the horse can't naturally vomit, unlike the dog or human. It has a very relatively small intestinal tract, a limited ability to digest starch, but it can. But then you go into, you're trying to get a very convoluted, complex hindgut in a relatively small space in an animal that gallops to get away from the predator because it's a prey animal. So its gut is very complex because it has big sections that are quite wide that might even do a 90-degree turn and go into a small section. So you have this complicated, and then you have a hindgut, which is highly responsive microbially to the digester reaching it. So if you put all of that together in very simple terms, that if you change the type of food from grass to hay to a complementary feed, and then you affect the processing of that feed and therefore how available it is in the small intestine, it really affects not only the time they spend chewing, therefore the amount of saliva produced, therefore the nature of their swallowed bolus, then the rate of passage through the gut, then what nutrients are available in that small intestine because of how quickly it goes through, and then what reaches the hindgut, and then the effect on the hindgut fermentation. And then you have to realize that unlike a dog and a cat, or even human, it's really difficult to evaluate those aspects and look at them because the horses are in general very large. So that's a very short overview of why it's so complex, but also why it's so interesting to try and unpick it.
Yeah, I really thank you so much. That was a really fantastic summary because I know it wasn't an easy question to answer in a few minutes. But I really like the way that you brought it in from, the saliva all the way back through the hindgut. And I think also discussing some of those things that maybe, just aren't related to diet itself, but the horse being outside and, being able to walk over long distances, being a herd animal. Those are also things that become so important when it comes to how we feed and manage our horses. And very often those things are maybe the parts that are really inconvenient for owners, I guess. I think a lot of people want to keep their horse in a small isolated paddock so it doesn't get injured. And they want to go and maybe feed it hay like morning and evening like they would their dog. And it's just not how we can approach that with our horses because they just haven't evolved to be kept that way or to eat that way, to be managed that way. So I really, really liked your answer and your insight into that. And so given how unique the horse is and this very complex and unique physiological system that it has and the unique way it's involved as well. From your perspective, what do you see as being the biggest challenges or problems when it comes to equine nutrition and feeding horses today?
That leads beautifully from your just discussion there, because the horse has these specific feeding behaviors and this unique digestive anatomy, but it also has a unique physiology. And as you said, that evolved or developed and helped it to maximize the chance of survival under the conditions that it originally evolved. We have now domesticated the horse and we've altered those conditions. So we've altered the conditions in which they now need to survive. So as you said, we often require them for very good reasons to be in a stable, but they have more restricted movement. We choose mealtime feeding usually because they're convenient for us, because of the way we manage our lives. And often, for very good reasons, again, we might feed them meals that have high levels of starch and sugar, and also importantly, this reduced forage. So if you asked me, based on all of that, what is the key challenge? I think it is to try and ensure that our feeding practices better match the needs of horses in general, and then the individual in particular. And then we still need to remember that we want them to have a role in our lives. And that might be as a companion, as a riding horse, or a performance horse. And so we need to really balance those needs. And I think you again brought up the most important challenge to me around that is the fundamental role that forage plays in a horse's diet. And then we have to realize that forage is not forage. Forages are very variable and they need to be matched to the individual. So a good example of that is in the UK. In the last few years, increasingly some pastures that were really used for high-performing dairy cows have been repurposed for horses. But if you think about that, that means if you put a pony out on such a pasture, effectively they can ingest more energy in a day than is needed to fuel a racehorse twice their size. So it's no wonder when you have those imbalances that they put on weight. And that, I suppose, brings back to my original on our discussion. It feeds into the challenge of education. So the information we give people has to be accessible and practical and relevant and also up to date. And we keep on learning and our facts change. And this is often confusing to the owner and carer. So one thing that I'm sure many of you have heard of is the equine metabolic syndrome. And when it initially came out, it was linked with primarily animals that were obese. The laminitis risk, an increased risk, was linked to equine metabolic syndrome, and that was obesity. But we now know that the actual main risk for laminitis in this area is insulin dysregulation. In fact, that both obese and lean animals can be ID. Obese animals may be at greater risk, but you could have lean animals equally. So I think the challenges are understanding and then changing. I'm going to give you 3 challenges. One
Oh
is,
my gosh, please go ahead. No problem.
but I think my other challenge for all of us interested in horse nutrition and research is, from our research and practical experience, shows that horses and ponies do not all respond the same way. And they don't respond the same way to the same feed or feeding practices. And also not all owners have everything available for them. So I think a challenge practically is to balance facilities that are available, the time constraints and the cost constraints, and availability of feeds and hay by the owner and carer with the needs of the individual animal. And you could say that that really only applies to big yards where they want to, for time, to feed them all the same, but it still applies to smaller enterprises. I think an example, I'm going to go back to obesity because it's a big issue, a welfare issue in many parts of the world, is that some animals put on weight very easily. And we need to recognize that and put practice in place before they become obese. And then we have to, because once they're obese, we have to perhaps make more dramatic decisions. But we have other animals that have problems putting on weight. So it can be really challenging for the individual owner to manage that. And you think about the big yards, but I'm going to use an example for myself. So I have an overweight pony, a normal adult horse, and a senior mare with no teeth. And I had to manage them on land, and I managed them really well on land, where I couldn't put up any stables. So now is really, you have to work out how you can do that. And that means that it can be challenging to owners and it's time consuming. And so we need to give advice and give support that enables that people can make those individual adaptations to the pony. And then realize, of course, my normal adult horse became older and he lost his teeth. So then I had another 15 years of managing a horse with no molars and keeping him fit and healthy, etc. So I think my challenges around those main areas, many more, but those are sort of the more general ones.
Yeah, I think I think your example in particular there with your own horses is one that really resonates with me, because as someone who worked as an equine nutritionist in industry, I would often come across these cases where maybe they had 2 or 3 horses and one needed to put on weight and the other, like you said, just got fat on air, and they're trying to do best by the horses. They want to keep them outside. They want to keep them together, but the fat one's eating all the food and then this one's not getting any food, and it just becomes so hard. And then getting them to bring in 2 different types of hay isn't an option either for these owners, and it becomes, to your point, very, very complicated when we start to layer, not only like breed disposition but individual requirement, and then if there's any health issues and performance on top of that, and the resources available depending on, where you are and financial constraints and geographical locations. I think it makes what could seem like a simple challenge of, reduce energy intake to help solve obesity. It's much more complicated than that. So going into more the obesity discussion, because it is of course a big challenge with our horses, our dogs, and our cats. How do we balance this idea of giving horses access to forage all day long, ad libitum forage, so to speak, with concerns around equine obesity? How do you approach that challenge, and what strategies have you found to be effective?
Firstly, just to come back about the challenges, I think this is where I would recommend, and I'm going to repeat this probably again, that veterinarians try and find a good nutritionist to be part of their support network. And if you're in especially if you have a performance horse yard where you've got a good farrier, a good physio, a good veterinarian, then also make sure you've got a good a nutritionist who is experienced, up to date, keeping their CPD, but you trust them and they know what you can do and they can help you adapt and they can help. It is possible, as I said, even without a stable, I managed with those 3 different animals. It was, you had to work around it, but it is possible and you can feed them and, they looked, even one with no teeth, she looked phenomenal and she lived till she was nearly 40.
Wow.
And her son lived till he was way over 30 as well. So it's possible, but I think sometimes getting some good advice from people you trust and but always make sure they've got the experience for the area and the topic. And I think obesity is one of them in particular. So again, maybe I'm making it complex, but I think your question had a number of nuances. Firstly, I'm going to go to when we feed horses. There's been some recent work to show when we feed conserved forage, so that's hay or haylage, up to 1/3 of what's provided ends up being thrown away. Now, in today's world, when we need to manage our resources in the world, that's not really a good way. So I think what we're trying increasingly to encourage horse owners is to avoid waste by more focusing on how much we should be feeding and how much their horse actually eats, rather than oversupplying. So we're probably moving, or I'm moving a little bit away from saying ad libitum. Instead, we're still trying, if they're not overweight, to feed them more around how much they want to eat, so how much they will eat. So we're still trying to provide them with as much forage as possible, but we're not oversupplying. But what we are doing, and one tip to everybody, I often get told horses are being on ad libitum, and yet when you actually manage to measure what they are eating, they're not. So we really should keep a better idea of what they're actually eating. And then we need to make sure, and we've come up, certainly in Europe, with a consensus that in the majority of horses, you should be feeding at least 1.5% of their body weight on a dry matter basis of forage. Obviously, there are exceptions, and we'll come to them, which you're going to, because I know you're going to jump in about obese animals. But we're starting off by saying, if you've got an animal that is not leading to weight loss, maybe we can provide it with as much as it can eat, but not more. Then we have to make sure at least we're providing that minimum unless they're on a weight loss. And of course, if they can manage on forage only, I'm just going to put another tip. Most forages are not nutritionally balanced, so we usually need a forage balancer. So we first of all said that actually we're moving away from that ad libitum because of that wastage. But we still want them to eat lots of forage. So the first thing is we need to match the type of forage to what their energy requirements are. So how much exercise, and be honest about how much exercise and what they want. If we want to give an animal that's not doing a lot of work, but isn't overweight at the moment, you might tend in general to go to a more mature, less energy dense forage. And those that, for an animal that's more likely to put on weight, whereas those animals that are struggling to put on weight, you're more likely to put a less mature forage. So you certainly need to work when your starting point is try and match those forages. There's lots more complexity to talk about forage. I could talk all day about forage, but we'll move on. But then we get that complication that now if we match the forage, but we're allowing them to eat as much as they would like, they're going to gain weight. So this is when we have to restrict forage intake. So your first is choose the right forage, then restrict it. And that's where we need to still remember that they're psychologically, physiologically designed to chew. So we need to think about ways to restrict intake, but prolong time chewing and foraging. So we've done a lot of work on the use of hay nets, strip grazing. We've been working with colleagues in Italy on the use of hay boxes, trying to find how we can maximize the time spent foraging, but minimizing waste and restricting. So we don't give them too much time when they don't have forage. And the hay boxes, we're also trying to look at how do we mimic the way they eat, their back posture. But again, hay boxes don't work for all. Hay nets don't work for all. So, and not everybody, they want them out in the field. So you have to think about things like grazing muzzles. And we've shown that we've worked with Dr. Annette Longland that grazing muzzles can reduce grass intake by an average of 80% in some ponies turned out for 3 hours. You need to make sure that grazing muzzle is well fitted, it's right, the horse is okay, and it's part of your program. But again, some horses don't work, they don't work well on grazing muzzles, and others, you really have to be careful because if you take them off, they just eat more, they just compensatory. All of these techniques have to be part of your program. I would rather people try and prevent obesity. So you look at your horse and what exercise you're doing, what it's likely to put on weight, and we try and match its feed and its forage to that so that we're not ending up with having to massive restriction. But in a lot of horses, I'm afraid, and I don't know, again, ponies didn't read textbooks, and a lot of textbooks were written about horses. And textbooks say horses eat around 2% of their body weight in dry matter. Well, they didn't tell a lot of ponies. So ponies can eat 5% of dry matter a day from our work, and they can eat 1% in 3 hours. It really, we need to start to try and prevent, and then if we have it, we do those kind of processes. But again, I come back, I'm just giving some minor little comments. It's really important to work with somebody to help.
Yeah, I agree with you 100% on all of those. And I especially like, coming back to that idea of you need a nutritionist, you need someone on your team, especially I think for owners that look at their horses every day. they might be almost blinded to the fact that maybe the horse is gaining weight or looks a little different, today than it did a month ago if you're seeing them so often. So having that fresh perspective and having someone in to, as a third party, I guess, to give you that news, and maybe set you on the right track is definitely very, very important. And so I guess, we know that obesity has been an issue and continues to be an issue. And I think we can talk all day just about obesity and owner awareness and education and different standards and different disciplines and how all that contributes. But because you've been an equine nutritionist and a leader in this field for decades, do you think the field has evolved over the course of your career, or do you think the priorities of owners and the industry have shifted at all in that time?
Absolutely. I think we've gained a lot of knowledge about fibers, highly digestible fibers. We've learned a lot about how we can add oil, which can add, in some cases, some energy without adding additional starch and sugar, but can be very useful in those animals. An underweight animal with insulin dysregulation, you don't want it to be fed high starch and sugar because that's just going to promote an insulin. So how do you feed them? So we understand a lot more about how you can add oil, what you need to do if you add oil. For example, you've got to think about vitamin E provision, but other things as well to make sure a balanced diet. But we have some great highly digestible fibers as well. So I think there's been a change in our knowledge of how we can use energy sources for the horse, because originally horses were out on grass when they were domesticated, and then back thousands of years they found if they fed barley the horses could work for longer and perform better. So in fact the first ever ergogenic aid was back around there. But now we increasingly know cereals have a role to play in horse nutrition, but actually we often need to balance them. And I think that's been the interesting to watch, how the differences of balancing, relating that to the type of needs of the horse, again, to those horses. And I think, so I would say energy sources is a big one. I think we've also gained more knowledge about how to manage animals with clinical issues. And in particular, more recently, a lot of our work has been dealt with how do we manage horses with insulin dysregulation? What should we be doing? But there's also others have done a lot of work about certain types of tying up and all kinds of conditions. Gastric ulcers, a lot of nutrition work. Nana Lutherson did some work and came up with some of the guidance that we now use about for squamous ulcers, for how much sugar and starch we should have in the diet, time between forage feeding. Those came from studies. Nana's was written in, about 2009. So it's a little while ago, but it's not that long ago. I think there's been a lot more on that. And I think in general, there's a lot more awareness of horse-centric strategies, whether that's in feeding or management. And I think that's great.
No, I completely agree with you. I feel like in the past, even, I don't know, 5-10 years, I've seen more high level performance horses as an example, managed on outdoor board, where people are really kind of taking in the horse into consideration and not just its performance and what they wanted to do and the owner's lifestyle as well. And I think the oil comment in particular too, because I know, in industry, again, when I was working, a lot of owners at first, if they weren't familiar with oil, would almost be a little cautious or a little scared because they didn't understand, well, how can you feed oil if a horse doesn't have a gallbladder? Like it can't digest that fat, and, it's not naturally eating fat out. You know, it hasn't evolved to consume oil. So I think going back to that education piece too, and making sure our horse owners know that no, it's okay. They can have oil in their diet even though they don't have a gallbladder, and we can do all these things and they'll be okay, even if it sounds maybe a little funky at first.
I think, however, it's also, there are the caveats. So yes, oil can be in, but often in fact, the horse has a remarkable ability to upregulate its lipase to digest oil. Surprisingly, it's almost much better than it is with starch. But the point is about oil, you've got to add it gradually to most horses because they need to adapt to it. So it's not like you can add a large amount. And also what we call, and this is a real difference that perhaps I didn't pick up earlier, is what we call a high oil diet in a horse diet is very different from a high oil in certainly a human diet. So, we recommend you could add in a mill of oil per kilogram body weight. So you're only talking about, and gradually, and if they need it, because oil is very energy dense, but it also doesn't contain other nutrients. You've got to balance it, as everyone knows. But I mean, the point is, you're talking about 500 mils into a 500 kilogram horse that could be eating 10, 12 kilograms of dry matter. And that's a relatively high. So that's the kind of level that we would recommend owners can work up to, but in divided doses. So again, I think it's very difficult in a short podcast to get over that these are sort of broad concepts, but there is sort of nitty gritty of what you should, and then there's palatability and what type of oil. I think it is, as you said, education to owners to understand that, when you change a horse from out at grass into a stable, you're changing movement patterns of water and their gut motility. So you just need to think about that. But also on ulcers, some work we've been doing again with Nana in Iceland. Some horses out in pasture or out where you would think they should have low ulcers can still have ulcers. And so some horses actually being brought in and given forage frequently and not being disturbed by others or environmental or behavioral issues may do better. Again, we're coming back to it's looking at that animal, but take the basics. So as I said, I think right at the beginning, we need to feed to horse in general and individual in specifics.
ProAmpac, your companion in pet packaging. Visit pets.proampac.com to explore our innovative sustainable solutions, such as our QuadFlex recyclable flat bottom bags, ProDura polywoven bags, ProEvo recyclable paper bags with grease resistance, and our ProActive recyclable film and pouches that run at optimum speeds on your felling equipment. Elevate your wet food, treats, and kibble brand by utilizing packaging that safeguards and preserves product freshness. Trust ProAmpac for packaging that cares for your pets and the planet. pets.proampac.com.
I feel like we've brought up so many issues and considerations in this short topic: obesity, ulcers, insulin resistance, equine metabolic syndrome. So we'll definitely have to have you back to talk about at least one of those in some more depth. But looking back on your research, and you've brought up quite a few topics already, are there any discoveries or any research in particular that stand out to you as being significantly impactful on equine health and how we feed horses?
I would say that we've covered them. I think forage, fiber, the importance, the relevance to the horse, and the variability. I think the increasing work we're doing that fibers are not fibers, and understanding a little bit more about grass and its impact on the horse, that grass is not the same. And we know, there are times of the year where an insulin dysregulated animal is very challenged. So I think for me, probably, I'm sort of going to come back that horses are not the same and we can't apply things. So in the past, for example, we thought we could base our advice to an insulin dysregulated animal on a non-insulin dysregulated animal and just transfer it across, and you can't. So I think some of the things are making sure that when we've done our research that we challenge our assumptions and we have evidence to back up some of our conclusions and advice, but also understanding that we won't have all the information and that we have to make the best of the information and pull it together. So that was why I was saying, if you're relying on someone, you want someone who's up to date because it does change. And we need to make sure that we're putting these pieces together in the best way for the animals under our care. But also that nutrition is so powerful. It's so powerful of what it can do. I think in particular, poor nutrition. There are many ways to feed a horse correctly, but there are some things we don't want to do. And I think it's being aware of those.
I agree with you. And I especially agree with having someone who is knowledgeable in the field. And I think just has an overall good understanding of maybe where our requirements come from for some things too, and why we recommend certain things and not others. Because I know for me, there's been a couple times when I've gone into the NRC and I'm like, oh, this was based on two ponies. And I'm trying to provide recommendations for, a horse in high performance or something that it's not, it can't really be compared. It's not apples to apples to where these recommendations came from. So I think we're moving forward, and I think we're finding answers, and we're, finding, like you said, these different avenues and opportunities for feeding different horses in different ways and what their different requirements and needs are. So I guess on that note, when you look into the future, are there any trends or emerging areas in equine nutrition that you get excited about, or what do you think the biggest opportunities are for us in this field?
I think there are some challenges. I think the exciting in the veterinary field in laminitis is some of the new drugs. But in having some of these drugs, we need to also make sure that we understand what the underlying principles of nutrition should be. I think that's exciting as an opportunity. I think recognizing the importance that nutrition can have for welfare, performance, behavior, and the role that it can play in trying to get that right, to have content animals that are suitable for the role and are living the best life they can. I think that is a role that nutrition is a part of that. So I think it is potentially a really exciting time for nutrition because it's recognized as being a component of all of those factors.
Yeah, I agree. It makes such a big difference in so many aspects, and there's still so much that we can do, and so many great things that have come from the research and our knowledge that we have developed over the years.
It's time for our famous three.
Corbion's Algaprine DHA-P3, the algae-based omega-3 DHA to boost brain, cognition, immune system, and well-being. Adding it to pet food is easier than ever. Cut out the middle fish and go straight to the natural source to enjoy all the benefits of omega-3 DHA. It's better for the planet with zero impact on the ocean and low carbon footprint, and it's easy to use. The highly concentrated biomass powder is suitable for multiple applications. Learn more at corbion.com.
And so I know I've asked you some very big general questions. So to end off, I do have a couple of little, hopefully easier questions, more personal questions to you. So after all the research you've done, all the time that you've spent, what keeps you inspired after such a remarkable career in equine nutrition?
I think there's still, much as I think we've got a lot we can now apply, there's so much more to know. And I just love the discussions with nutritionists and owners. It'll be an owner asking me a question. And I, just as an example, a few years ago, I was lecturing and someone said, well, how long do we soak hay for? Does it remove sugars? And I was really proud of myself because I could remember a piece of research and I was able to even remember who the authors were. But you know what? I went back and I reread that paper, and it was actually the same as putting a sort of a tiny bit of hay into a swimming pool. And I suddenly thought, is that right? And so from that came a whole series of studies that we did looking at how does hay work? So it's those questions that you suddenly think, well, I've always thought it did, but does it really? And then it'll be someone asking, and one of a colleague's mother asked, well, does strip grazing work? And then you have to do science. So for me, it's those practical questions that I have to then work with colleagues to come up with a science to prove whether it works or not, or whether it works under certain circumstances. What are the caveats? So I think there's lots of basic questions that I still want to make sure we have more information on. And it'll be the question, that easy question that someone asks you and you think, oh, I'm not sure I really know that, or there's more. And you picked that up earlier. And then I think there's also fundamental, if we're going to really try and manage a disease, like we're working a lot with people in Melbourne and Queensland on PPID, if we're really going to manage it, we need to understand the disease better. So I am really excited in just that basic fundamental work, because once we have those better bricks, I'm better to work with colleagues to give better nutrition advice. So I'm not sure I'm ever going to run out of ideas that we need to do. And as long as people keep on asking me questions, and they usually say, this is a simple question, and they're usually the ones that I go, yes.
I agree 100%. I've had that happen to me. I find more so with horses than with dog and cat, where I think horse owners generally are very interested about nutrition. And same thing, they'll come and they'll ask about something, or, oh, what are your thoughts on this and this, or what's the research behind this? And I have to stop, like you said, and go, has anyone done that? I don't know if we know that. And then I make a little note for myself, maybe one day someone should look at this. But on that same note, so for any students who are maybe listening and have now been inspired by all the opportunities and all the education that exists with equine nutrition, do you have any advice on maybe how someone could follow your career path and become an equine nutritionist?
I think, again, there's many layers to your questions. I think if you just want more information, I mean, you're very lucky in America, and because you have some great extension agents that provide some good information. We've set up a My Senior Horse website where hopefully we've got some good core information for owners to look at on different aspects, and that includes nutrition of senior horses and that. For the students who are more in depth, and I'm sure you're aware, there is the NRC, but also I did with colleagues, we wrote we didn't write, we edited and got a lot of our friends to write a lot of great chapters in equine applied and clinical and nutrition. I think there are also some, you have in the US, there is the Equine Science Society, where the majority of the people working in nutrition extension come to share their knowledge. So going and talking to them and finding out, how do I do those courses? How can I become, do a PhD or just help in some research? And that's a good place to meet people. There are actually, if you are already a nutritionist or a veterinarian who wants to expand, there are some good, in fact, online nutrition courses that are run as sort of master courses that you can do. And there are some specialist companies that some of them are university and some are specialist companies. And some of them have really gone to great depth to get a course together. But there is a caveat. There are also courses that are not really credible. And so I think if you're going to do one of those courses, then check the credentials of the people, check they're up to date, check the depth they're going to give you. Because we've spent nearly an hour here and we've just talked just top line. And any of these topics could be almost a day, just talking, or more than a day. But so I think I would do that. I think those are a good starting point.
I like that you brought up that there's good courses and bad courses, because I think that's a challenge for the average horse owner that's looking for information. You go on the internet and you might stumble upon something that is good, or you might stumble upon something that maybe isn't so good, I guess, so to say. So you had mentioned some websites too. Or is there anything you'd recommend for the average horse owner, just someone looking to have some quick insight into how to feed their horse?
As I say, I can say we've just recently launched with Equine Network My Senior Horse website. So we are trying there to make sure that the articles there have been reviewed by more than one person. But as I say, you are lucky. There are some great extension agents. And I would say if you're a horse owner is trying to start with the extension agents, maybe look at what's in your region because they understand your region, maybe talk to them. And then if you think, well, I'm not sure, just check on the internet and look and see if another extension agents are supporting that. So you get, you have to sort of check, is that information being supported by several credible sources? And if it comes up that several of them are recommending the same, you're more reassured. And then again, a lot of feed companies, their feed advisors actually are really knowledgeable and helpful. And some of them, get one isn't just going to sell you their feed, but actually is going to work with you to try and help. And then your veterinarians, some of them, and if they don't know, the vets can try and have in there, we've all coming back in their support network, a nutritionist they can call on, and I think for vets, I would encourage them to join some of the courses. We've got just out of interest, we've got a British Equine Veterinary Association. We're going to have a nutrition for performance horses for vets next year. And we've got some nutritionists and we'll be covering some areas. So there are courses around. It's difficult to be specifics because time changes and people's requirements of what they're wanting and the depth will change.
I think the takeaway really is, find an equine nutritionist who's experienced, who knows what they're talking about, and put them on your team. And I think that would definitely make the life of a lot of horse owners easier that way, having them part of their support network to support them, their barns, their horses, and everyone else on the team. So thank you so much, Dr. Harris, for your time and your insights today. I know that just like you said, we just skimmed the surface of equine nutrition, our evolution of understanding, the challenges, considerations. But it was such an honor having you as a guest on this milestone episode of the Pet Food Science podcast, where we talked about horses for the first time. So hopefully we'll have you back again in the future to discuss more in depth some of the topics that came up today, because I think our listeners would really appreciate that. And I really enjoyed it. So.
Thank you. And, I'd like to thank, I'm privileged. I work for Mars Horse Care and Spillers and Buckeye, and they are being supportive throughout, that the work we can do, we can share with people. So it's great to work for, a commercial feed company that really is keen on doing work that we can share to help everybody.
And I think not only work that you can share, but it's a lot of very fundamental research, I think, too, that does require funding, and someone has to be the one to do it. So I think that in itself is really exceptional, that you have this fundamental research that's being supported by industry. I think we need more of that in general.
So yes, thank you very much.
Of course. And to our listeners, thank you for listening. We hope that this has been a fascinating and informative podcast for you today. It definitely was for me. And if there's a topic or an individual that you'd like to see us have on this special series as we continue, please let us know. And don't forget to keep tuning in as we explore more science of equine nutrition and how we feed our horses.